All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Go ahead and find your seats. Welcome, everybody, to today's seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I am the Research Program Manager here at Hatfield. And thank you again all for showing up for our seminar today. Just a reminder, this is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks online, we do have your cameras, mics, and screen shares disabled for this event, but we have a volunteer in the room, Roseanne. Hi, Roseanne. Who will help you with any technical issues you might be having, or if you have any questions for today's speaker, go ahead and put those into the chat box, and Roseanne will read those out to our speaker at the end of today's presentation. For folks in the room, just a reminder, if you can sign in to the sign-in sheet outside, it does two things for me. It helps us keep track of outreach numbers for our speakers. It also allows us to justify buying you all cookies and coffee. So if you can sign in, that's really great. Other thing for folks in the room, when we get to the question and answer section, if you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic. That way the folks online can hear your questions and participate with us as well. All right, a couple of quick announcements. For next week's seminar, we have a really interesting speaker coming to join us from the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission to talk about Pacific lamprey returns on the Columbia River, and that's Lori Porter. So I'm excited to have her come down and join us. So that next seminar is February 29th in this room at the same time. But the reason you're all here for today is for today's speaker. Fiona Tomas Nash is a scientist with the Mediterranean Institute for Advanced Studies in Spain. She received her PhD at the University of Barcelona and conducted postdocs at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Bodega Marine Labs with UC Davis. Her work takes place mainly in the Mediterranean Sea, but also here in Oregon and Washington, where she focuses on the ecology, conservation, and restoration of coastal and estuarine communities, mainly those dominated by seagrasses and algae. In the current context of biodiversity loss and climate change, Fiona aims to understand the impacts of different human activities, such as coastal ecosystem mechanisms that provide resilience, and hopes to contribute to applied knowledge to enhance conservation and restoration of these ecosystems. Fiona, we're excited to have you here today. Go ahead and take it away.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. I put the word sex in the title because seagrasses are not usually considered very sexy. In Oregon, most people care about megafauna or fish or oysters, but I hope to convince you in the next few slides that seagrasses are actually sexy. They're really cool, super interesting, and that you actually do care about it, even if you don't know. And so, no movement. Right. Okay, so for those of you who don't know or don't care about seagrasses, we're gonna do a few basics of what seagrasses are and why do we care. And so what are seagrasses? Well, these are seagrasses. And you may think, well, what's this? These are all marine mammals. And yes, because seagrasses are basically the marine mammals of the plant world. And by this, I mean that they have many similarities. Both have terrestrial ancestors, right? So mammals appeared on land, evolved on land, and they have all these adaptations to live on land. Terrestrial plants, as we know them, they also are a result of evolution on land. They have roots, they have leaves, etc. And then a few of those mammals and a few of those plants actually went back into the water and were able to adapt to fully live in a marine environment, like seals. Well, seals, no, because they also are on land, but dolphins, whales, etc. So the seagrasses are basically the dolphins of the plant world. Because it's so hard to actually live in the sea, like cetaceans, there's low diversity, right? So there's about 60 species of seagrasses when there's hundreds of thousands of species of plants on land. So that to me makes them pretty cool because they're very, very unique in what they are and what they can do. Like mammals, they are also a polyphyletic group, means that the evolution back to water occurred several times, and this happened about 100 million years ago. So I think they're pretty cool. And also they actually are super important. And I'll touch on this in a second, but they're very unique. I know they kind of look boring, but they actually are, they have very unique traits that allow them to live in the sea and to colonize successfully. And so basically they are clonal plants, meaning they generate one clone after one clone after one clone, which is what you see on the right. It's the same genotype, right? And so there's the rhizome, which is this below ground stem that grows, and new shoots or new individuals or new plants, however you want to call them, grow. They have leaves, they photosynthesize, etc. And this vegetative or clonal growth is the main way that these plants expand and colonize the sediments. Because they have roots, which is a plant trait, they're able to colonize all these soft sediments, which algae cannot do. Okay, algae need a hard substrate, so that's why you mostly don't find, or you find algae that are basically drift algae on the sand, or they are on rock systems, right? So these plants are able to colonize all these soft sediments in the coastal areas that otherwise would be these deserts. In addition to being clonal plants, they're also flowering plants. And this is where the sex comes in, no? And so they do flowers, so they have sexual reproduction. And as you can see in this figure, there's a size of forms and a range of sizes and forms. So we have seagrasses that are this big. We have seagrasses that can be 3 meters long. So there's a large diversity also because they're not all from the same genetic group. And so, as I said, even if you don't know it yet, you actually do care about seagrasses. And why do you care? Well, because if you care about going fishing, eating salmon, eating blue crab, eating oysters, all these animals are very closely linked to seagrass beds. Usually, seagrass beds are a very important nursery habitat. So for many of these organisms, the juvenile stages live in the seagrass beds because that's where they find food, where they find protection from predators. And so if these seagrass beds disappear, these babies disappear, and your food disappears. And not only that, but if you care more than fish and shellfish, they actually also provide a lot of what we call ecosystem services. So they protect you from shoreline erosion because they attenuate the wave action, they trap sediment, they trap carbon, and so they are what we call blue carbon ecosystem. They contribute to mitigating climate change. They, of course, I already said they contribute to biodiversity economy. They also, by trapping particles, make the water cleaner. So there's all these functions, ecological functions that translate into actual benefits to us. So hopefully now I've convinced you that these marine plants are actually really amazing organisms, very unique, super important. But of course, unfortunately, we're in this tragic moment of the world where many things are going bad, and one of them is the seagrass lost worldwide. So these are two maps. The world map is from 2009, so it's not updated anymore, but it's the only worldwide review that was done so far. Basically, all the circles are where there's been studies, and you can see that a lot of them have red, means there's been a significant decline of seagrass. The other map is of Europe. It's more recent. It's from 2019. And again, the pink shows seagrass declining. And again, there's a lot of pink. So clearly, seagrasses are suffering worldwide declines in all the coastal areas that we know of. And there are many reasons for decline. Pollution, habitat destruction, nutrient pollution is a very important one. But one that's of increasing concern is climate change. And here, what I'm going to be focusing on is warming, and particularly the the marine heat waves, right? So these marine heat waves are occurring worldwide. Mainly marine heat waves are moments when the waters are warming much more than they usually warm, and they last for a certain time. So it's not just the mean seawater temperature that's going up all over the world, but there's these extreme events that happen. This map just shows recent, well, on the last decade or so, marine heat waves that have been reported throughout the world. Here, the different symbols just indicate that there's been, reports on negative effects on ecosystems and socioeconomic, etc. But I just wanted you to look at this to see that basically marine heat waves are occurring all over the world. And you may be familiar with the one that was called the blob, which occurred in the Pacific, the Northwest Pacific. It occurred here in the Pacific Northwest, which lasted between 2013 and 2015. Basically, there was this warm water blob that didn't cool down, and this caused mortalities of marine mammals, etc. And it also affected the local eelgrass beds. And this is just one example. This is data from South Sulu National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is a research reserve in Coos Bay, where they have seagrass beds, and they have been monitoring the beds since the early 2000s. These are different lines represent the different sites, and you can clearly see that after the blob, a lot of them collapse. And these are pictures of one of the sites, Balearic Islands. So this is 2002. You can see all of this is seagrass. The boat can barely move because there's so much seagrass. This is what it looked at the intertidal. And then 2017, so a couple of years after the blob, there's basically no seagrass. This is all algae. And in 2022, it's pretty much the same. So there's been a major collapse of the ecosystem associated with this marine heat wave. But there is some recovery, right? For example, in this site, Culver, seagrass is coming back. And this is one of the things that I want to kind of talk about today. What are these mechanisms of recovery after a seagrass loss due to marine heat waves? And so, as I said at the beginning, seagrasses mainly grow what we call vegetatively, right? So this rhizome, this plant just creates a clone after a clone after a clone, and that's the major way that they expand and recover after they die. But they're also flowering plants, so they do have sexual reproduction. And this sexual reproduction is important because the results of sexual reproduction provide genetic variation, right? And that's key in order to be able to adapt to new disturbances, to new environmental changes. Also, the products of this sexual reproduction very often are units of dispersal. The flowers could be dispersing. In some cases, it's the fruits. In some cases, it's the seeds. So this allows to escape the disturbance, colonize new areas that presumably will be better environments. In some cases, the seeds remain in the system buried, and they form what we call seed banks, which allows the recovery after a major mortality. And also, more and more, these sexual reproduction units are being used for restoration purposes. So they're important to consider. And so this figure here is just from a paper that talks about the different factors to consider when we're thinking of seagrass resilience as the ecosystem. And I wanted to point out the part that's intrinsically linked to the plants themselves, and in this case, the sexual reproduction. So these flowering plants, how do they reproduce? Well, because it's a polyphyletic group with a high diversity of plants, there's actually very different types of reproduction types. The most common is the typical of pollination of the female and the male gamete. And then there's the seed, and that's it. This is eelgrass, so the seagrass you have right here in the estuaries in Oregon. The eelgrass is a monoecious species. I think that's how you say it in English. Basically, one individual has both male and female flowers in the same individual. And when the pollination occurs, the seeds, which are these, are formed here. And so in this case, you can have dispersal because the flowering shoots break off, and float around, you can have that the shoots already have the seeds and they also float. The seeds can also break off when they're mature and float, and they can also sink in the sediment and have seed banks. So this is, for example, one thing we're studying in South Slough, where we've seen all these seagrass loss. How important are the seed banks there? It's like, what's the potential, the natural recovery potential in these beds that have lost? Are there seeds that can allow some recovery, or are all the seeds gone? This is another example for a species from the Mediterranean Sea, Timodothea nodosa, which this is a dioecious species. So here you have male individuals and female individuals. You can't really tell, but that's a male flower. And these flowers are tiny. I've dove a lot and I've never seen a female flower. They're really, really tiny, but they manage to find each other. The seeds are formed below ground because the ovary is basically down here. And so when you're looking for seeds, you actually have to go and remove the sediment. So these seeds don't float, there's no dispersal, this make a seed bank. So just two cases that are very different types of reproduction. And there's another one that I'll talk about later, of course, which is the main thing of this talk. And then some species of seagrasses also do vivipary, which is very unique in plants. Vivipary is what we do. Most mammals, except I think the platypus, are viviparous, right? We give birth to an organism that has developed. We're not putting out an egg, right? Which would be like if you're putting out a fruit. So this has been found mostly in mangroves, but there are two genus that have it. And the reason, so the main point here is that instead of having the seed develop on its own, and develop a seedling, germinate and develop, the seed remains attached to the mother, it germinates, and once it's mature, it's when it detaches. And so it's very different from the normal dispersal mechanism of being a seed or a flower or a fruit. And it's very rare. It's only 6 species of seagrasses that do it. And so now that I've set up a context of what seagrasses are and more or less what they're suffering and how they reproduce, we're going to go to the Mediterranean Sea, which is where this story takes place, which is a very unique place. And we're going to talk about Posidonia oceanica, which is a unique species. It's endemic to the Mediterranean. And it's kind of like a sequoia of the seagrasses. It has really slow vegetative growth compared to any of the other seagrass species of the world. And so just, this rhizome can grow about 1 centimeter a year up to 6 centimeters, really, really slow growing. The individuals can be up to 50 years old. It's a very long-lived, slow-growing species. So it's a problem when there's mortality of this plant because the natural recovery rates of this plant are really, really slow. And so this just shows, again, the rhizome, the leaves, and this is the inflorescence, which is the reproductive part, which we'll talk about in a second. And of course, Posidonia oceanica is also a very, very important seagrass in terms of ecosystem services. It contributes to water quality, coastal protection, fisheries, etc., like all the others. But I just wanted to point out, because it's really unique in this sense, Posidonia oceanica is one of the most important contributors to blue carbon of the world. Okay, so blue carbon is this trapping of organic carbon that doesn't get respired, and so it's not being converted into CO2. And blue carbon refers to the coastal ecosystems that contribute to that. The main contributors to blue carbon of the world are mangroves, which is represented here. So this is the boreal forest, temperate terrestrial forest, tropical terrestrial forest. So the terrestrial forests contribute this, mangroves contribute a lot. And then in seagrasses, you see there's a lot of variability. And these high numbers over here are because of Posidonia oceanica. And why is that? Because as you can maybe see in this picture, all this is dead rhizomes of the seagrass that have been accumulating actually through millennia. So this is more than 4,000 years old, okay? And so all this carbon is trapped here. It's not respired, and so it doesn't go back to becoming CO2. So as we say in Spain, Posidonia is the la reina, the queen of blue carbon, because it's very, very, very unique. And so any degradation of this species is really important in terms of its per capita contribution to trapping carbon, right? And the Mediterranean, it's a wonderful place, but it's also a hotspot of warming. And so we've been undergoing major warming much faster than in other areas of the world. This is a map showing the number of heat waves that have occurred in the last 30 years. These red colors are more than 120. So there's a significant problem of warming in the Mediterranean Sea. And we know that this warming induces mortality of this seagrass, Posidonia oceanica. This figure here is basically showing mortality in the y-axis in relationship to the annual maximum seawater temperature. This was work done in the 2010, and basically the warmer it gets, the higher the mortality. And they calculated that since the 2002, the mortality had increased 35% compared to mortality observed before 2000. So clearly, there seems like there's a major heat stress that causes a decline of this seagrass. So we've been talking about how seagrasses may reproduce and how that may be a resilience mechanism, a recovery mechanism against a stressor, in this case, warming. So how does Posidonia reproduce? Well, Posidonia oceanica doesn't reproduce like any of the other species I told you. It is like eelgrass, so it has hermaphrodite flowers, so it has male and female flowers in the same inflorescence. So this is the inflorescence. You have multiple flowers, male and female. They pollinate. So this, you can see the fruits starting to kind of form, and then the fruits form, which are these, and they take about 6 months or so to grow. And this is very unique only in the Posidonia species. When they're actually mature, they pop off the plant and they float. And they start dispersing through the water. And so here what you see is a picture of basically taken from underwater of the sea surface, and these are all fruits floating. And what happens that these fruits drift, and many times they arrive at the beach. You know? So these are all fruits of Posidonia, which we actually call marine olives because they literally look like big, fat green olives. So they're called olivas de mar. And so these plants don't have any dormancy. These seeds don't have any dormancy. So at about 2 weeks after they start floating, the fruit opens, the seed drops, and it germinates. So this could be in the middle of the ocean. It could be on a beach. So the problem is that a lot of these seeds don't make it to a good habitat. And if they make it to a good habitat and start growing, they grow pretty slow, but a lot of them don't survive on the long term. So recruitment success is really, really low. So that's why the main growth of species, the main way this species grows is vegetative, and because it grows so slow, when it's degraded, both vegetative and reproductive responses are not very fast, right? So it can be a problem. Also, flowering in Posidonia oceanica is not very common. Like when I was doing my PhD, I was diving for 4 years nonstop and never saw a flower. It only flowers once a year. Like, for example, eelgrass flowers many times a year. It's usually in the fall, so sometime between September and November. It's still very unpredictable. It seems like it's related to nutrient availability, maybe the age of the plant, but there's still a lot of things we don't understand what's driving this flowering. So this is just an example of flowering intensity at 2 sites in Italy from 1983 to 1999. And you know, sometimes there's some flowering, but low, 7%. Many years there's none or really little. Then there's 1 year there was high flowering. You know? So it's very variable and quite infrequent and unpredictable. And then what happened? In 2003, we had a major marine heat wave, the strongest marine heat wave recorded until then. And what we saw is that there was extensive flowering across the Mediterranean. So it was like, okay, maybe there is a relationship. And indeed, what some people did, Elena Diaz and colleagues, they compiled data from all the med that they could find, looked at through, I think it was 10 to 20 years. They looked at, temperature data, and basically what they found, the figures that show here, is that basically the amount of flowering, so here they call that flowering prevalence, so the amount of beds that had flowering increased with temperature, and the amount of plants within a bed that flowered also increased with temperature. So in this case, it seems like flowering may be a response to thermal stress, which could make sense and say, okay, this is a bad stressor. We need to do this genetic variation input to either have more genetic variation for new thermal stress coming. These plants also, these fruits also float, so maybe also to escape to other areas. So that's how it's been interpreted, right? That thermal stress is triggering this sexual reproduction in this case. And so then in 2022, so 2 years ago, we had another marine heat wave, which was the strongest marine heat wave. Again, I think we've had another one in 2023, which has been even stronger, but it was the strongest recorded since that one in 2003, where we saw the first mass flowering. And what did we find? Well, so a colleague of ours is collecting data from all the Mediterranean. This is the data he's collected so far. And so basically, you can see this is a qualitative index, because we're combining presence, absence, observations with quantitative. But basically, you can see that in the Western Mediterranean, there are a lot of reds. So indeed, after this major marine heat wave, we've seen again a mass flowering, and this is what it looked like. Okay, so all these beds have all these flowers. I know they don't look super sexy because they don't have pollinators, but it was quite incredible. And what happened in the Balearic Islands? Well, that's where I work. So, we were all very excited. Wow, this is amazing. What's going to happen? What is this going to mean for all the fruits? Are they going to recruit? And then one day I'm sitting at my desk in January, and I get this picture. And this is something I've never seen in my life before. It's been sent by this guy, Jonathan Delgado, who's part of a marine citizen science program that we have that's called Sea Watchers, within which we have a project on seagrass reproduction, because it's really hard to study seagrass reproduction because it's rare. And he sends this picture, and to me, it looks like something similar to something I saw once in a paper. So I call Dr. Enrique Ballesteros, who's a good colleague and the author of this paper that I'm talking about, saying, hey, we've seen this. Is this pseudovivipary? So I've told you about normal reproduction, vivipary in mangroves, and now more things, pseudovivipary. So what's pseudovivipary? So pseudovivipary, which I'm learning about, is asexual reproduction, so not sexual, no sex. Okay, this is where the no sex with stress comes. And so the plants, when they're starting to create the reproductive tissue, so the flowers, instead of doing that, they shift and create a clone of the mother plant. And so basically, it's vivipary because this clone is attached to the mother, like in the vivipary, but it's pseudovivipary because it's obviously not coming from sexual reproduction. So that's why it's called pseudovivipary. And so here, instead of having a seedling, which would come from a seed that germinates that's attached to the mother, it's a clone of it's a baby clone of the mother. And this has, again, like vivipary is rare, this is also super rare. It's found in about 50 plant species in the world, mostly in environments that are stressful, like alpine, Arctic, and desert, no, for example. And you may have some pseudoviviparous cacti or stuff in your house. Well, maybe not in Oregon, but you could. And so what's the seagrasses? Well, when I saw this picture, I knew that pseudovivipary had been once described before by Enrique Ballesteros, who I showed you in the other picture, for Posidonia pheanica in the Balearic Islands, in one of the islands. And he had observed this at one site right after that 2003 marine heat wave. So the prior huge marine heat wave, he saw that. And then a few years later, there was another description of Pseudovivipary for another Posidonia, in this case, Posidonia australis in Shark Bay in west coast of Australia, again, after a marine heat wave. So in both cases, they found this anomalous botanical phenomenon that never been described in a marine plant before. In the Posidonia oceanica case, in the Mediterranean case, it was only the morphological. So, you could see that there was the peduncle that would lead to the flower, and instead of a flower, there was a baby plant. And in the case of the Australis, they actually did the genetics, so they confirmed that they were exact clones, the mother and the daughter. Okay. So I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. What's happening? We need to study this, of course. Like, this is a unique event that's never seen before. And so we start snorkeling and we start seeing, well, I call this guy, Jonathan. And I'm like, I think it's this, but I don't know. Can we meet? Can we meet? And we finally, in March, we meet, we go snorkeling, and we go to this site. And because they have evolved, it doesn't look like this anymore. It actually looks like this, which is what I'd seen in pictures. So we're much clearer. So very pretty. And the meadow is just full of them, absolutely full of them. So I'm like, okay, this is amazing. We need to study this. So my students, my techs and I, with no funding, because obviously this comes out of the blue, nature doesn't, wait. We start sampling to answer the first main questions to describe this phenomenon, because it's something that no one has ever done, right? People said this was happening, and that was it. They didn't study how much was happening, what the consequences were, any of this. So basically, finally getting to what we actually did. So we had several goals. First, is this actual Pseudovivipary in the sense of, can we demonstrate it genetically? Because the first time that was described in Posidonia oceanica was just a morphology. And although we believed it was, if you send the paper, they'll reject it because you don't have the genetic evidence. So we want the genetic evidence. If this is Pseudovivipary, how much is happening? What's happening to these plants? What's happening to the adults that are producing these plants? And also, once these plants grow, what happens with these plants? Do they die? Do they disperse? What do they do? And so first we did the genetics. So we collected at 2 sites. We collected 60 through a 60-meter long transect. So every 2 meters we collected a Pseudoviviparous plant with the mother and the clone. We also did a vegetative vegetative plant that had no reproduction, and then also actually flowering plants. Anyway, I'm just showing that, well, I'm not showing any data because I'm not the geneticist. Gabriele Procaccini, who's the expert in genetics of Posidonia oceanica, is that person who did it. But basically, yes, all the plantlets were clones of their mothers. So we demonstrate this, and this just shows these 2 sites, the sampling I was telling, so we sampled from 0 to 60 meters, and these are every 2 meters. We haven't genotyped everything yet, but basically each color is a different genotype. So here, for example, there's one genotype that's pretty large, because it goes from meter 20 to meter 6, more or less. Here, this is the same genotype. This is another site, so different genotypes. So there's a clustering of genotypes. And the important thing is that we demonstrate that there's genetic evidence that, yes, this is Pseudovivipary occurring in Posidonia oceanica. So where is it occurring? So basically, then we went about in Mallorca first, which is where I'm based, and we sampled these sites that have the pie charts and counted the seagrass, how much there was, and how many shoots were pseudoviviparous, flowering, had fruits, etc. And then through snorkel, we looked at present absence and in all the sites that have triangles. And basically, what did we find? Well, pretty much everywhere we looked for, there was Pseudovivipary. So it's not a one-site phenomenon thing. It's happening all through the Balearic Islands. We found, in most of them, the Pseudovivipary. because we are sampling in May, which is the end of the, so flowering occurs in October, a lot of these plants are degraded, but you can still see that they are flowering plants. So the flower will be dead. So we know those are non-pseudoviviparous, no? So we can distinguish. And then we found individuals that had both. They were bearing both fruit and plantlet in the same plant. So, which is interesting. And I don't know how the plant is deciding how to do this, unless there's two combos. But anyway, so there's it's anyway, interesting, unique. It's all, and also in Australia, in the Australian Posidonia was also found too. But basically, this is again the first time that Pseudovivipary in a marine plant is observed at a large scale, okay? Because the other two were just found in one site, just described there. So a major evolutionary phenomenon of plant reproduction, that's been observed here. So obviously, I'm super excited about this. And so we said, okay, let's try to figure out what's happening to this plant. So in one site, which is this one, Illetas, which is the one with the biggest pie chart in green, which is the Pseudoviviparous, we set permanent plots, and we marked vegetative and reproductive plants, Pseudoviviparous plants, and we monitored through time. We would measure the size, the development of these plantlets, et cetera, and of the adults, no? And so now I'm going to show you some of the results of what's happening with these plants. So looking at plant development. So basically here, we started, so in March is when I finally went to the water and with this guy and saw this. So there's already division. In April, we're like swimming around. In May, we collect the data for the genetics. And then in June, we finally do the plots. The main important thing I want to show here is that by March, so assuming these plants were formed in October, so when they're about 6 months old, they're already dividing into several shoots. Here's 2 divisions, 3 divisions, 3 divisions. This one has 8 divisions. You may not be able to, but there's potentially 8 new individuals forming from here. This one has 5, and they are developing. We are losing numbers, but because either they are detaching, because these are the permanent plots, or because we lose the actual mark of the plant. No, but the main idea here is that we have a wider range of plant development going on when the plants are presumably 6 months old. And these plants can be very big. So this is the leaf length, and this is the number of leaves. So basically, no matter how many divisions you have only 1 subplantlet, or you already have 5 at the beginning, you're relatively big, so 12 centimeters, and the leaves start growing, with development. The number of leaves starts decreasing, but importantly, and of course it makes sense, that by May, you can be already a pretty large plant. And if you think about the same age of a seedling that's developed, this is like 4 times bigger, okay? And so the ones that have more divisions obviously have a higher accumulation. And so you have really big plants after 6 months. And these plants start developing roots. And that's important because rooting is going to be important for establishment, right? And so we monitor roots. And here basically is the same figure as before. So the proportion of, or the number of pseudos from the different size classes. And you can see in the percentage is the percentage of individuals that have roots. So there's still no roots in May. In June, late June, the roots start appearing. And by July, all of the size classes have roots. So even the ones that only have 1 individual have roots. So so again, these are just some pictures of different roots. Some can be very long, some other small, but root development is critical. So it's important to note. And we see that, this is what we see in the next slide, that the number of roots depends. Most of them have 1, 2, 3 roots, and some roots can be pretty long. And here I think you can kind of see. So this is probably 7, 8 centimeters. So sorry, this one. So they're big plants, and these are all still attached to the mother, which is well. So what does this mean for the mother plant, right? So this is the size of the mothers in May, which is when we collected all these plants for genetics. And clearly, the more you invest in sexual reproduction, the worse you seem to do. So this is the number of leaves, the leaf length, and basically this is total leaf area, so photosynthetic biomass. The plants that reproduce sexual reproduction normal are the smallest, the ones that have mix, that have both fruits and survivipary. So these do a bit better. Pseudoviviparies do better, and the ones that don't reproduce at all are the ones that are the biggest. No? So clearly there seems to be a detrimental effect of reproducing in the plant, and it's more detrimental if you reproduce sexually than asexually. So this potentially could have implications for the long-term effects on the plants. And this difference that we see here, that the pseudoviviparies do worse than the vegetative. We monitor this through time in the plantlets, and basically it's always the same. So black is vegetative, gray is pseudoviviparies. This is patterns through time. This is leaf area, leaf length, number of leaves, leaf width, and this is the total leaf area. So basically, the vegetative plants are consistently bigger throughout the season. So it's not like the other plants recover. They seem to be always doing worse. They're smaller, they're thinner, and they have less leaves. We've also measured mortality, and so far we haven't seen any difference. So there's not a higher probability of dying if you are doing reproductive behavior. But one problem we have with this data is that we've lost a lot of the tags. So actually, this is based on a very low number. So we don't know, but we'll try to do some later analysis, or maybe absolutely fine to reproduce and not die, because these plants do reproduce, and not the plants are not dying all the time. So it makes sense that the plants are adapted to this. So finally, what happens to these plants? So you're creating all this, you're investing this energy in creating these clones. And so what happens to these clones? Do they remain in the seagrass bed? Do they recruit in the seagrass bed? Do they detach? So we basically conducted visual censuses where we set transects, and every 3 meters we would see if there were or not these plantlets, and if they were present, we would count how many, and we compare this inside and outside. This is just the two sides, but the main idea is the same. So this is the presence of attach in gray and loose plantlets in black through time. And basically at the beginning, so in July or in the summer, there's still a lot of plants attached. So they're nearly a year old and they've been attached to the mother, they're still attached. But by the fall, October, November, there's a decrease. This is the same in the other side. And this is the number of plantlets you can have in one particular area, right? In one particular point. And they can be clustered. So sometimes you can have 7, and it decreases through time. And if you compare this with outside the meadow, you see this decline, which I've already shown you, but you see that there's an increase of plantlets after the fall, right? Mainly September, October, November. So this is probably associated with storms, stronger hydrodynamic conditions, and the plants are bigger, so they're probably they break off the plant and they get dispersed. And this is the percentage, and this is the number. So you can have sometimes, aggregations of 6, 7, 8, 10 plantlets in one area. And for one of these sampling events, we counted all the individuals. We measured all the individuals in terms of their number of roots, their root length, and how many divisions they have. And what we saw, so basically, this is the ones that are attached. So between 30 and 60% of them had roots. The loose ones inside, there was like a high variation, but the loose ones that are outside, which are the majority, so we found, more than 250 individuals that are outside the meadow, so much more than the ones that detach and stay. So basically, when plants detach from the mother, they seem to leave they don't stay inside the meadow. And half of them more or less have roots, which is important because that's going to be critical in able to establish into a new environment, right? If you don't have roots, you're going to be drifting. And we see that, roots can vary. This is the mean number containing zeros, but the bigger you are, the more roots you have, which makes sense. And some can have even 8 to 9 roots. So far, we know that, we've described a widespread, unique botanical reproductive phenomenon in a marine plant, the genetic conformation, and it seems to be probably a response to heat stress, because the only time that's been described has also been after major heat stress. These plantlets can grow fast and large. They develop groups when they're about 9 months, so that means that they can start colonizing, but they can remain attached for a while. And most of these plantlets do not remain in the bed, but seem to be dispersed outside. So, what are the implications of this, and where are we trying to go? No, because one of the first things is, why are these plants developing pseudovivipary instead of regular sexual reproduction? Why is this happening? And what is driving the mechanism? So there are epigenetic mechanisms involved in the terrestrial plants, so we're going to look into that. For example, in alpine plants, they are able to detect if the snow levels are very high, so they know that the spring is not going to be long enough for the seed for the flower to be fertilized, the seed to develop and germinate and blah, 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 and grow enough that it can survive because of the snow. It's going to be too cold. So that's when they shift. So they have a mechanism that allows them to detect that the environment is not going to be good enough for long enough for the sexual reproduction to happen. And so they shift to this asexual reproduction. So, but how does this relate to warming? It's unclear. Also, if you're doing this, you're losing your genetic variation, right? So why would you do this at such large scales? Maybe because these plants grow faster than the seedlings, and so maybe they are able to recruit better when there's this high mortality. This is something we're following, so we're monitoring. We've been planting plantlets and seedlings from the same age and seeing how they're doing to see if there's a difference, no? But we don't know yet. Also, is this just occurring in Posidonia, or are there other seagrasses where this is happening? Who knows? And what are these long-term consequences? No, because we know that warming induces adult mortality. It seems like sexual reproduction is not, it's probably not very good investment for the plant. So maybe pseudovivipary, the adult plants do a little better, so maybe that's why they do it when there's a major heat wave. But does that, we need to look at the long-term consequences for the plants and what's the success of these plantlets. So it's all like a naturalistic observation that started from a guy doing citizen science, which has become this amazing phenomenon to study. And of course, this was a lot of work by a lot of people. And so I want to thank them all, and no funding. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, I already liked seagrasses, but I think your enthusiasm is completely infectious. So thank you for sharing with us. I appreciate it. I want to switch to questions. So any questions online? It looks like Roseanne has one for us.
When these plantlets with roots break off from the mother shoot, are they positively buoyant? And if so, for how long?
So they are not positively buoyant. They don't float at all like the fruits do. So I think I think they're being moved around by, currents, waves, but no, because sometimes you actually, they're still attached, but they're rooting next to the mother. So they weigh, so if it breaks, if the peduncle breaks, they are, I would say, neutral to a bit negatively buoyant. They're definitely not positively buoyant.
Great. Questions in the room?
Thanks, Fiona. It's a great story. In the question of sort of why and the parental costs, have you seen anything different about the parents that do pseudovivipary versus sexual reproduction versus vegetative only in your beds?
So not yet, because so from what we know, when plants reproduce sexually in Posidonia, it doesn't seem to have a bad, like a negative effect, like the production of leaves and the rhizome growth before and after is pretty similar. So I was surprised just to see that such a clear linear different. But we have to go back to looking at those plants. We haven't done that yet. Visually, a lot of the pseudoviviparies were dead or had one leaf, but again, we have a data problem there that what I would say is none of the vegetative are dying, and definitely several of the pseudoviviparies have died. But why would for example, when we're doing this monitoring, there's hardly any normal reproduction going on, right? So we will try to compare across other sites through a destructive method that we can kind of look at the rhizome and discern when it was reproductive and not, and how long ago, etc. So we can then look at mortality, but we don't know that yet. And a priori, we would say that the history of Posidonia oceanica doesn't indicate that there should be a major mortality. I mean, it makes sense. Otherwise, if you flower a lot and you die, but the pseudovivipary thing, well, but the mass flowering is very uncommon. We've basically seen it twice since Posidonia has been, well, no, 3 times. In 1998, I think it was, which was also a very warm year, which is when initially I showed you that Italian data from a long time ago. That was also a heat wave that had a massive flowering. But we don't know yet. A priori, it shouldn't, but my eyes have suggested something else, but maybe I'm just biased, So we'll have the data speak to us.
Roseanne, any questions online? Okay. Don't forget to put your questions into the chat box if you have questions.
Thanks, Fiona. So what else is on the bottom there? And the reason I'm asking this is reproductive shoots in Chesapeake Bay zostra, neutrally buoyant or negatively buoyant, will entrain themselves on worm tubes that are sticking up out of the water long enough for the seeds to fall off and therefore land in a suitable habitat. What else is on the bottom there for these plantlets to attach to or to be stuck so that the roots can get established?
So they either, there's either the healthy seagrass bed, which they don't seem to attach well. And actually, we've done some planting, and I don't know if it's the leaves of the adults that score them out and it's gone. Then there's sand, but sand is terrible. They don't do it. And so one place where they could recruit is that these dead rhizomes. So when the seagrass dies, all this rhizome remains, at least on the short term. And for example, it's a very good place for seedlings because it has all this, irregular mesh that has, so they fit there and they can get trapped. So mat, which is this dead rhizome, would be the first one. We've also seen them drifting to Thymolothea beds, which are the smaller seagrass, but that's usually also sandy. And they don't seem to stay because it's not stable enough. So it's either or rocks. But in rocks, I don't think that they are able to attach. whereas seedlings do, because seedlings, when they develop the roots, those roots stick like glue. So they stick to the rock really strong. But these roots are fully or very highly developed when they float away. So I don't think they have the capacity to attach to rock.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the pseudoviviparous individual that forms on the parent. Was there a flower there first?
No. So let me see this.
So it wasn't a cleistogamous flower?
So here, so that picture that says peduncle.
Mhm.
So where the peduncle is, that's where the flower would come. But instead of forming a flower, the plant started forming a new clone. And so the flowers never appear.
So like a spider plant.
Yes. Yes. So yes, that's why I was saying some people have plants in their house that probably are pseudoviviparous. Yeah.
Other questions in the room? Other questions online, Roseanne? Okay. Fiona, thank you so much for spending time with us. We appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
I understand you're heading home soon. But I will be incredibly curious to find out what happens this year.
Yeah.
If you had another.
I know there's no flowering happening at all anywhere. So there's been another major heat wave. Nothing is flowering, nothing. Like there's very few flowers. So I think that, the plants gave it all last year and they can't flower this year. It's too much.
So no plantlet formation is
No,
expected
no
either.
plantlet, no fruits, nothing, no normal reproduction at all. Not even the normal flowering. Nothing is happening.
The story continues.
Yes. It does.
Interesting. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Give Fiona one more round of applause. All right, we'll see you all next week. And thank you again, Fiona. All right, for folks online, we're going to end today's presentation. Thank you so much.